Joe, it's great to be back with you and continue our conversation around survival skills for school leaders. So, can you tell us about some of the tactics you use for maintaining focus and balance in the intensity of school life?
In schools, we're trained right from the very beginning that our absolute number one priority is keeping children and young people safe, and that whole safeguarding agenda. But actually, if you kind of extend that notion of being able to be good at prioritizing, deciding what can wait until later, what you need to do right there and then, what you need somebody else to do. And that is just, of course, good delegation. It's good kind of time management skills. I always start my working week with my trusty notebook with my list of things to talk about in staff briefing, which we have on Monday morning. But actually, that also helps me look ahead to the working week or maybe the next 2 weeks, the time, and create my list of priorities. If I don't do that, it's so easy to just be sucked into the hurly-burly of school life. The job is never done, and you can end your working day at whatever time you choose to end it because there are always things to do. And so being a good prioritizer and allowing yourself to recognize that there are going to be things that you have to do that day, that week, that term. And there are things that you really ought to do. And there are things you'd like to do, but aren't necessarily going to make it to the top of the list. It's really important. Part of that process is, of course, doing the right things and starting with your intent, your educational vision, and those things can be very nebulous. Those notions. What's your school vision? What are you really trying to achieve? But actually starting with those and pulling yourself individual as an individual and as a senior leadership group back to those core purposes, those core values, probably the things that you've recorded in your vision and value statement and then have translated into your school development plan. You need to keep pulling yourself back to those as priorities because otherwise your priorities are the whack-a-mole school of educational leadership coming in, responding to the first person at your door, the person that sent you those emails. Part of that prioritization process is sometimes hard. Just before logging onto this online, my assistant head came to talk to me about something is really high on my agenda. We've got an issue with a particular student that we need to sort. She'd gone away, made some phone calls, done some work. I was really keen to share that with me. And that's time pressing. That's quite urgent. But actually, I knew that I also needed to be online. And in 1 hour's time, I can go back to her and check that we can do that. So the ability not always to respond to the knock at your door or the person standing at the front of your queue, and to have the, the kind of the nice person language ready to talk to people in a way that makes them realize that their important thing is your important thing too, but actually we'll deal with that maybe in an hour's time or are you free then? And actually, I feel like over my time as a head teacher, I feel like I've kind of almost developed this, and hopefully it doesn't seem it to other people, but this kind of default language, which is hopefully gentle, kind, respectful, professional, acknowledging other people's priorities at the same time as being able to be confident in myself that no, that actually isn't the most important thing at the moment. This is the most important thing. So it happens on a really kind of, I suppose, wide level from your vision and values and your SDP to your priorities to your day to day interaction with people. It needs to be in a way that makes them feel important and appreciated, and their big thing isn't um devalued in the kind of language that you use with them. I think that massively comes from experience and almost what I'd call a kind of fluency in your leadership style. One of the things I definitely always feel in the school summer holidays is that it takes me several days to decompress. I joke at home when my husband says, what should we have for tea? For 2 or 3 days, I really can't make a decision. And I have to say, hey, do you know what? Anything would be lovely. I really, because I feel like during the day-to-day of educational leadership, we make so many decisions each day, from the sublime to the ridiculous, that actually when you step back from the working week or the working term, you need some decompression time for that. But for new school leaders listening who are sitting there going, oh, yeah, God, yeah, all those decisions, how do you prioritize them? And genuinely, that gets easier quite quickly with experience, I'd say.
And as you say, and going back to those plans that you have put in place and all the time you've put into doing your school improvement plan, whatever it is, use it, go back to it.
So much of the work we do in school is connected. And if you've started from that point and you're really, really clear with yourself about what your priorities for the year are, the recognition that you're not going to solve everything for all people, that you have limited resources to do those things well, and that kind of pragmatic recognition of what you're going to be able to achieve, alongside a kind of a genuine passion and idealism about what you'd like to achieve, as long as you're maintaining those two things in balance, everything else in your school should come from that. And then that can be translated into something as practical as schedules and calendar dates. And like I talked about at the start of the week, writing in the notebook the order of priorities for the week. Those things that prioritizing or scheduling is then turned in from something that you're trying to create a shape for into schedules. I know that in a week's time, at my SLT, it's important that we think about the content of the subject leaders meeting and we set the agenda. And I've given myself enough space, my colleagues enough space to recognize that's coming up, think about what's right to be on that agenda, to have some time to go away and reflect about whether those are the right things, to do the work behind that. So the quality of experience for the subject leaders in that meeting is going to be a really positive one, and that it fits in with our priorities for the year. And that's just timing and scheduling. Those things that can be so lost in the hurly-burly of day-to-day school leadership. And so again, if I gave a kind of a tip to maybe new school leaders or school leaders that are finding it that prioritization is a real demand on them, is that very organized, giving them time and space, carving out time and space to look ahead and to plan the various practical steps that need taking in order to make those key events, those key schedule points run as effectively as possible.
And I like what you said there as well about balancing pragmatism and passion. And I guess there's a lot of balancing to be done in leadership life, as well as taking care of yourself. Because in order to be able to do those things and work in that balanced, planned way, I think you need to be in a good space. So, what do you do to keep yourself in that positive space where you can maintain your poise and think in that planned, careful way?
Yeah, that's the holy grail, isn't it? Of staying sane in school
Yeah.
leadership. Um, Something like really last year that a member of my staff said really resonated with me, because there's a tendency for us to think that the more accountable you are in a school organisation, the more stressful that job must be. But I had a lovely conversation that really stopped me in my tracks with my midday supervisor. My midday supervisor is a just and super lady that's been a midday supervisor at the school for, oh, I think over 40 years. And she takes her job really seriously. Students love her, and she's part of the fabric of our school. We changed the queuing system for lunchtime. We spent some time talking about that. We communicated that to staff. And Mrs. Harris said to me, she said, I've had a completely sleepless night, Joe. She said, I know the plans are in place and I understand what the plans are, but I'm really hoping that it works well. I'd given very little attention to thinking about that plan. But for Mrs. Harris, that had caused her a sleepless night. She felt accountable, ownership of that lunchtime queuing system in school. It really made me think that whatever your place in the organisation, there are things that if you're doing your job well, that you worry about. I hate the thought of her having a sleepless night about something which the rest of us weren't losing much sleep over. So whether you're a head teacher or whether you're a lunchtime supervisor, it's really important that you have all the tools to keep yourself well and safe. So in practical terms, there are several of us in school across all kind of parts of the organizational structure who are mental health first aid trained. And we have done that in order for staff to be able to give our young people and their colleagues and their friends and their family members tools and strategies to respond to somebody who is experiencing poor mental health, or even just the day-to-day elements of feeling stressed. That's worked really well, not just because they feel trained to be able to support others, but actually that training has helped them think about triggers for them, about what keeps them well and, mentally well and fit. So that's one thing that we have invested in as a school and really paid dividends, I feel. We've seen the outcomes. There's lots of work around work-life balance, and I feel a responsibility as a school leader, not just to give that lip service, but to really live that. And I think there's a recognition even at government level with the encouragement for staff to take their PPA now off school site, for example, a recognition that we need to be strategic and creative and open-minded about what genuinely helps people find the balance in their worlds. So, in giving them the tools and the training to understand themselves, that kind of cognitive awareness of what one's stress container looks like and what the taps are for that stress container to release that. And that's at the student level, that's at staff level, right to the really structural, procedural things. A lot of schools now have a well-being being charter. But actually, if this conversation is about how you do that at the top of the organizational structure, how you do that as a head teacher. The first thing I think is really knowing yourself and understanding yourself.
Mm.
When we appoint senior leaders, as part of the recruitment process, we take some psychometric testing, and nobody really likes completing a psychometric test. What we always do then is we also share the findings when that person is appointed with us, because the reports that are generated from those often are kind of penny dropping moments for staff about, oh, yes, I see myself in that. I identify myself in that. Those are definitely characteristics that are both can be blessings and curses for me in my kind of day-to-day life. So knowing yourself or knowing how your personality or how your character or how even indeed your leadership style can work really well in some situations and how sometimes it can be an obstacle in others, and that kind of self-awareness. So I suppose knowing yourself, that self-awareness would be the first step. Once you have that kind of that self-awareness, then it's about recognizing situations that you find yourselves in where that character, that leadership style is working or it isn't. It's a bit like, I think everybody agrees, you type an email. If you're at all unsure about sending it, then you probably shouldn't. And recognizing those kind of those situations. Recognition as well that we're not always good at everything all the time. And so building a team around you as a head teacher where you know that another member of your team might be better at or more successful or more diplomatic or more tactful in a certain situation. It's really good. When you're new to headship or senior leadership, you feel like you feel the accountability weighing heavily, but that kind of permission you give yourself or that expectation around delegation or entrusting or empowering others to do things that you aren't necessarily best placed to, I suppose is the other thing.
Mm.
There's no detriment to yourself. There's no judgment about your kind of leadership style when you are delegating those things. I think probably a lot of us would say, a lot of head teachers would say we like to control things. We'd be, to the point where we jokingly describe ourselves as control freaks, and it's resisting that urge and that temptation. And then there's the obvious things that we read about all the time. I am conscientious about how healthily I eat during the school term because I know that that will have an impact on my energy levels. Every time I make a commitment to myself that my exercise regime is going to be regular, and that's a really hard thing to stick to, but it's really important. It's about knowing the other things that really help you manage your well-being. I've discovered in the last few years a real enjoyment of paddleboarding. And when people say, oh, where did you find that? Or why did you like that? You can't answer emails on a paddleboard. And actually finding something that takes you out of yourself or out of your kind of normal thought process,
Mhm.
your kind of are really good things. And for me, that's the thing. For the people, it's playing music, singing in a choir, playing as part of a sports team. And it's so important not to let those things go. We're really good at preaching to our staff and telling our staff they need to find space to do things, but we really need to practice what we preach. When I was first in teaching, the best advice that somebody gave me was around deciding on the times of the week when you really aren't going to work. So whether that's Friday evening through Saturday, Sunday morning, and start your work on Sunday afternoon, and that works for you in your family situation, then set yourself put those parameters and try and stick to them. I've been really interested to follow and in some European countries, that they've enshrined in law this idea to protect employees about emailing out of working hours. And I've seen some really great stuff from other educations and other schools that have at the bottom of their email sign off um, or kind of almost the opposite of that. You know, I send emails and receive emails and respond to them at a time that suits me. I respect that that isn't necessarily the time that will work for you. So feel free, please, to reply at a point that works. I think actually just enshrining nobody should email after 5:30 actually doesn't work for our working parents that want to leave at 3:40, put their kids to bed, and then start working again at 7, for example.
It comes back to, I think, something you said earlier about paying, if you're going to pay real attention to staff well-being, it's also that recognition or balance in life, work life, that it's not one size fits all, is it? Different people need different things.
We keep reaching for this term balance, don't we? And
Mm.
I talked about psychometric tests, and one of the things that I would share with you about my psychometric test is it comes out as very balanced. Sometimes I think that's really dull. It sounds very unexciting to be a balanced person. But I think so much of what you're doing in schools is that interaction with people, whoever those are, whether it's young people, whether it's parents, whether it's other stakeholders, governors, mostly in my position, kind of staff day to day. And actually, you're not going to be liked by everybody. You don't go into school leadership expecting or knowing that. You're gonna have certain people that really like the way that you do things or the way that you run a school and will be big advocates for you. But actually, that kind of balanced approach, that responding to people with warmth, with generosity, giving them your attention, listening to them, all of those things are really important, and avoiding these kind of extremes of emotional reaction. The people that I found it most difficult to work for are the people where I think I'm not going to be able to predict how they're going to react emotionally to the day to day kind of professional roles. Sometimes I stand in my school reception between lessons, or break or lunchtime, because it's all a real thoroughfare, and I can catch lots of people, and I can, be seen, I suppose, as a school leader. And occasionally, people will say to me, "Can you, smile? It might not happen," or "Are you okay?" And I'm thinking, "Oh my goodness, what's my face saying?" And actually, that kind of presenting yourself as this kind of figurehead in the sport, even though your brain's working on some problem, or actually you've had a really manic start to the day, or actually there's something going on at home, even for you as a head teacher. But that the way you present yourself in that kind of responsive, open, I'm happy to be here kind of way, I think is also a practical tip that I would give her teachers. Arrange your face with consciousness when you're presenting yourself publicly.
Oh, amazing. Thank you so much, Joe. And just maybe one last little question. I wondered if there was any particular reading, resources, things that have helped you reflect or learn?
Absolutely. One of the things that I find is a most time efficient way to now keep up to date is through podcasts. Our podcasts I can listen to driving to and from work. I can listen to those while I'm exercising sometimes, cooking in my kitchen. And I found them to be a really good way of keeping up to date. The High Performance podcast
Hmm.
is one that I would really recommend. It's a podcast where people that are leaders in their or have been particularly successful in a particular field, whether they're sport people or politicians or successful actors, they talk about everything from their leadership style to the leadership challenges that they faced. And earlier you asked me about just sometimes reach outside of education to do that. There are a lot of education books, of course, out there, and they're great, but sometimes it's refreshing, especially if it's out of hours or your weekends that you're listening, to go outside of the educational world. And if I was to give you one tip, the high performance podcast would be my tip for today.
Perfect. That's amazing. Thank you so much, Joe.